if you'd like. You're welcome to, but I'm not going to put you on the spot if you don't want to.
I can ask questions like everybody else.
All right, that sounds good to me. We'll see. It's pretty free flowing here, but I'm excited. Plants in space. It's a thing. Actually, I guess there was an article released just a few days ago that China just grew their first plant on the moon or something like that. I got to read the article. I haven't read it yet, but I saw that in my news feed. Google knows all.
I have to say, on the moon doesn't sound right.
Yeah, that's why I'm like, I'm not remembering it correctly. All I know is there was a plant grown in space. So. I think it was a cotton seed.
It's good. We can make shirts in space at least.
That's definitely going to be on the list of things you want.
Yeah, absolutely. I was on the International Space Station. All right. Well, it is. Sorry. Go for it. All right. Well, it's 6:01 here, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm sure more people will roll in, but if not, no big deal. So yeah, thank you again, both of you guys, for coming up here and sharing your knowledge with the community. I think this is going to be a really fun conversation. I first think maybe some introductions would be great. You guys can introduce yourself, a little bit about your background, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, sounds great. I'll go ahead and start. Hummy, been a part of the community since I think mid-October. Seems like a long time, but then again, it's hasn't been that long really. Everything's kind of new here too. So, but originally from the Midwest, and my brother is Humdog Floyd, also on the call, and he's gonna, introduce himself as well. But we're from the same hometown basically, and in that hometown there was a small company, an agricultural company that raised inbred seed corn. Foundation seed corn is what it's called. So we both kind of grew up doing that from a really young age, like 14. We both started working in the corn fields every summer. Did that through school. Got on with the company full-time after high school. Didn't know what I really wanted to do. But after doing that for a number of years, decided that I would like to go to school for that. So left the company and went to college full-time. I basically sold everything I owned and I went to college and did that for about 4.5 years. Then came out of college and went right back to the company after that because I had a lot of contacts and I was doing some pretty interesting research. I did a couple of internships with the company that we work for as well. So that kind of led into the research portion of my career, which lasted about probably 7 of the 10 years was pretty heavy duty research, and I did a lot of protocol writing. So wrote a lot of research studies for row crop research, production research really. So trying to squeeze the most efficiency out of the crops, trying to make the processing operation efficient as well. Did a lot of research with plant growth regulators and pollen research to try and understand how pollination is most successful, especially for corn, because it's a very important operation, like it is for all crops, but for corn breeding it's extremely important. So did that for a couple of years and then jumped into management and really have been in managing people in the operations at a couple of different locations now. So it's interesting. I've been at 8 different farms across the United States. So I've been stationed in Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Hawaii, and now Washington State, and a couple of different farms in Iowa as well. So I had a lot of diversity in the regionality of where I've been. So I've seen it done a lot of different ways. So it's been an interesting run the last couple of years, and I've done a lot of moving. So I've been in Washington for about 2 years now and just love it. And I don't think I'm going anywhere anytime soon. So that's a little bit about me.
thank you for the introduction. And yeah, why don't you jump in here, Humdog?
Hey everybody, I'm Humdog Floyd. I'm Hummy's identical twin brother. We both started working at that same exact company, and I ended up leaving the company a little bit to do some conservation work, but then came right back, and I've been with them ever since. So I've been with them pretty much since the 90s, and been involved with inbred seed production the entire time. So I've been in the foundation, that original foundation group for that company. Highly focused around purity, seed purity. I run crews of inspectors doing agronomic inspections on our growing area ranges about 80 miles, and we try to grow anywhere between 300 and 500 different seed varieties, and we're growing for inbred seed production. So I've been in the industry for about 25 years now, and been involved with many different facets as far as planting, harvesting, processing. We also have a very large production facility that goes along with the growing operation. So I've been heavily involved with that. And in the last few years, the focus has really been on lean manufacturing. So I've taken on kind of a role as a trainer in lean manufacturing. And that's a little bit about me.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the introductions. So yeah, about 45 years combined experience in growing, research, and managing food operation or growing of crops. So I'm sure you guys have some pretty strong opinions when it comes to how to successfully do it on a large industrial scale. And I kind of want to just maybe ask some questions about growing crops here on Earth first, and then how maybe that would apply to space, and what maybe some of the challenges would be for both. So I think to start off here is what do you think is the most challenging aspect of providing such a large quantity of crops? And just kind of maybe define some difficulties there, and I'd love to take it from there.
Doug, you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. So I think some of the difficulties we have right now are a lot of them are weather based. So really, a lot of the damage and losses we have in production are based on weather and pests. So and pests, I could mean insect, large pests such as deer, different fungal, bacterial pests. A lot of different losses in those categories. So. Those are some of the challenges that we really face now. Other than that, it's logistics and trying to make sure that we can reach all these areas. And I know, where I'm at, I'm centered out of the Midwest. We pretty much get timely rains here, but where my brother's at, it's almost entirely dependent on irrigation, and that can play major factors in your production lines. So. Yeah, I guess maybe I went on a tangent.
Yeah, so I guess to follow up with that, obviously pests and weather are a big one that apply very much so on Earth, but the logistics side of things, with the way that technology is there and a lot of automation and likely heading towards more automation, what are, I guess you're growing, you said about 80 miles worth of crops around a range of areas. What are the logistic challenges there? Assuming that you're probably having mostly automated workforce for a big bulk of it, but with people involved as well. Where exactly are the challenges when it comes to organizing and producing that amount of crops?
Well, actually, we do have a large amount of people still involved, but you're right. Technology has really grown. In my career, technology has gone from almost everything being done by hand, to everything either automated, everything sensors. So, like for instance, in our drying operation, we handle around 25 to 30 million pounds of different seed varieties. And all of those seed varieties have to be dried on ear. That's how you do seed corn production. And it takes quite a feat. So while that's being done, the corn has to be laid out across tables and sorted. And a lot of that is done either by hand or now with optical sorters. So it definitely speeds up the operation. And as far as technology goes, everything is just blown up. We've seen a major advances in GPS and RTK technology. Everything's down to the inch, and we can count the number of kernels that got planted into a single row across thousands of acres. It's we use a lot of different technologies right now. Drones are becoming really big as far as scouting goes. I'm actually a licensed drone pilot, and I'm a commercial operator for our operation. And we can do stand count analytics, we can do plant health, all those different things with technology at this point. And so as far as production goes, that's really speeding up production, and our yields at this point are the best they've ever been.
And
Yeah, I can
sorry,
add
go
on
for
to
it.
that a little bit. Like he gets to do all the fun stuff like fly drones. I just get to do all the boring stuff like manage people and budgets and stuff like that now. But yeah, it's really a key question. What are those things that are really make it a challenge? Logistically, you'd be surprised how much our operation looks like one of the production chains from the game. And that's because everything in every step in the process relies on the step before it to complete, right? So we're doing a batch at a time. So like my brother said, we're drying it on the ear, so you have to take an entire batch, you dry that entire batch on the ear, and then you shell that entire batch, you put that entire batch in a box, and everything through that whole process for that batch has to be cleaned down to the kernel. Everything we do in the foundation operation is based around purity of the lines, really. So every time we run a batch, and a batch could be 1 acre, it could be 30 acres. We range in size all the way through. And every time you run one of those batches, you have to clean the entire process. So it makes the logistics of the flowing product through the process extremely important. That's where on the processing side, we've done a lot with automation in terms of PLC programming. Everything's computerized and everything is tracked through the entire process, because we have to have that traceability to be able to prove what seed that is. It can be fingerprinted genetically, so you have to be able to prove its provenance through the entire process, and that's one of the major logistical challenges for us.
So with logistics and automation and everything, kind of becoming just more. I mean, it's just going more and more automation every year. I've read quite a bit about this as well, but I'm curious now if we apply this to maybe moving this to growing plants in space. We're probably going to assume 300 years from now, we're going to have a lot more automation. We don't actually necessarily worry about pests and weather in the same sense as what we would do on Earth. But I am curious, if you're growing in greenhouses in zero gravity space, I'm wondering if you guys have opinions on what are those challenges, those logistics, and potentially managing and making sure that actually gets done. Because crops in space, it's pretty important to feed people, and when you don't have a natural environment that can grow food pretty much anywhere, I would assume that failure is really not an option in space.
I think you nailed it. I think from a strategy standpoint, you'd want to diversify that supply as much as possible for that exact reason, right? I mean, my brother and I, we spent quite a bit of time since we first, brought up this topic and started talking about doing this, thinking about what these different things might be, like what that technology might be. And there's some really interesting things, and some of the things are actually being done today. So one thing, the gravity piece is kind of tricky. Plants do rely pretty heavily on gravity for a number of different things. Probably most notably for the way that they get water and nutrients through the soil and move those nutrients through themselves. I know, for instance, NASA and the ISS has to use they use pillows of clay to try and force movement of water and nutrients into the growing medium. But there's also other things you can do as far as greenhouses go, like hydroponics and things like that, to try and do that, and some of those are very efficient. So it's hard to believe that some of that wouldn't be incorporated, at some level. There's some interesting things going on today as far as like bioengineering, and I think you think 300 years, in the future, there's going to be some pretty good advances to things. I think one in particular would be like drug production. Right now, if you have to make a drug, it takes a pretty complicated process and manufacturing capability to do that. But if the drug is based around a protein, you can actually engineer a plant to make parts of that, or most of, or in some cases all of that protein, and then you use that protein in the manufacturing process, and it can help kind of bridge the gap, around having missing processes because you're on a space journey. I think that's one thing that comes to mind. Super high efficiency plants as far as water usage and nutrient usage would be extremely important as well, especially nitrogen usage. Plants use nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus heavily. Those are the macronutrients. They also use a number of micronutrients that are sometimes, critically important, although in small quantities. So you'd want to make sure that you have adequate supply of as much of the nutrient load that you can do. Sorry, I can stop there and see if there's any more. I could probably talk for another hour and a half. So.
No, I mean that's fantastic. Chris, you got something?
Well, we brought up pests a couple times, and I was actually curious. I don't know how easy it is to answer this, but is it even possible to assume that pests won't be a problem, or is it something that we should assume would be regardless?
I think as far as some pests goes, yes, it would be a problem. There is bacteria, seedborne viruses. Plus, you have soil. So anytime there's soil, there's a chance for microbial pests. There's always that risk. I think. I don't know. I was talking to my brother earlier, and I said that in a lot of ways, I wish that I could grow in space right now, because our biggest problems are really weather related, and then large pests. So we have deer issues in the Midwest. So we do have pests as far as insects go, but we mitigate those through spray and other different ways.
Yeah, and I can add on to that too. I think the likelihood of getting in a situation where you've removed 100% is really low. And some of those fungal pathogens can hide. They can go generations. It's really interesting. Now in the Midwest, there's a big problem with nematodes, which are a microscopic pest, but they can stay in the soil for 30 years, and they're really hardy. And when all of a sudden, when the conditions are right, they can pop up. I think you'd want to have in your back pocket definitely some ways to remediate some of those things. I mean, weed control, not so much, because it's going to be pretty heavily controlled, right? But especially the fungal and the disease piece, you'd want to have that, some ideas around how to handle that, as well as one thing that would be really important would be having a restoration nursery and a seed lab. You'd want to have a library of pure seed and a restoration nursery to have the ability to regrow your stock. And especially on a long journey like that would be really, really important.
Yeah, I think the seed stock library, we've talked about this many times, would be probably the most important thing you could possibly have. And you would want to include as much diversity as you could possibly get, even if they might not be plants that would be grown at the time. You never know when that's going to be the one that saves it all. It's happened several times through history with different crops where one variety might save it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I guess I was thinking about it, in the end, soil. It's not like you can completely sterilize it, right? Because then you're killing off all of the beneficial microbes for the plants. So you kind of have to accept that you're going to get some pests and just deal with that.
Yeah, you're exactly right. There's going to be ways to reduce that and try and mitigate it as much as possible, but you definitely want to have ways to control that on board.
So I think this leads in pretty well to the next question that is kind of a combination of both my own and one of our community members. But are there particular plants that are especially challenging to grow that may apply to, here on Earth, and then ones that you think would carry on to be more challenging to grow in space versus, plants that may be easier to grow? I'm not really sure what makes a plant hard or easy to grow, but I'd be curious to hear your guys' opinion.
Yeah, great question. I mean, that would be a really key question, especially for the planning phase of a long journey like that, right? I mean, I think there's certain plants that are. I think it all depends on the way you're asking the question. Difficulty can be, represented in a couple different ways. One of them is efficiency, and I think that would be of a pretty high concern to people on a space journey. It would be just how efficient and how resource allocation. I mean, with finite resources, we've seen it already. And you guys building out the production chains, efficiency and waste and recycling is really important, and it is in plants as well. So there's some species are really efficient at using the resources available. Some grasses, and they're efficient because they produce a high amount of usable material per input, right? Corn is one of them. Potatoes are one. Wheat is another. Some of your really staple crops that we see across the globe are that way because they provide a huge number of calories for the amount of inputs that you do. And those would be ones that you'd want to have on a trip, for the same exact reasons. But there's also plants, that may be difficult that you'd still want to have and bring along. And I'm thinking like some of your lettuce varieties, some of your vegetable varieties can be really tricky to grow. Some of your melon varieties actually take chemical processes to help produce, like seedless watermelons. How do you grow something that doesn't have a seed? Well, you use genetics and chemicals to kind of alter the genetics so it can't produce a seed. That's how they do it today. So there's some crops that are grown today that are complex, that honestly might not make it on a journey like that just because of the complexity. So like when I read that question the other day, that's where my mind went really, was there's some crops that are almost not worth doing on Earth. And so they definitely wouldn't be worth doing in space.
I don't know if I could live in a world without watermelon. It's like my favorite thing ever.
And that's fine, but I think seeds are going to be in your future.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting. I'm sure you know of and have read about, the seed bank in Svalbard and what, like, basically that's our doomsday vault for if something were to happen, we've got like every seed on the planet, there and ready to be transported to where it would need to be. I would assume that, the RVAD probably has to have a pretty robust seed bank, and then the ones that are grown actually on the ship, I would assume, are going to be your staple crops because they're high calorie, easier to grow. But once you get maybe to a dahlia, that's where the greenhouses can kick in, and you could potentially grow a lot more variety.
Yeah. And there's also some interesting concepts. Like I love the fact that you guys put science around the food making portion, because like there's some really interesting things happening with algae right now, and they've been able to like bioengineer algae to produce a number of different proteins and things like that. I can totally imagine a system where you could be producing algae and turning that protein into food using some kind of other process as well, once you get into a dahlia and to the different asteroids that you're going to be on.
So another question that we had here, accidentally clicked the wrong thing, was, from Thunder here, it might sound dumb, but have they tried growing tree species in low G? Would trees be something that are potentially possible to grow in space?
That's a really tricky question. I mean, so trees are made to overcome gravity. Like that's what they do with their bark. That's why they can get so tall. The cells on the outside turn to, harder. They're harder. They're woody. That's That's what they are. They're made of wood. So, but that's what it's for. It's to overcome gravity. I could imagine in the right setup, tree species would work. And honestly, if I was on a ship for 150 years, I would want trees to work as well. Where I could see gravity maybe having an effect on that is nutrient uptake and like the water, the way the water flows into the roots, and as well as like the way that the plants sense gravity. They sense gravity and they accommodate it for it, right? They can grow against it. They put their flowers and their different machinery in positions based on gravity. And so that may change, and that may, necessitate the need for, different technology to help pollinate, different things like that. I could see it having a pretty major physiological effect on things. One thing that's really interesting about zero G that they found on the ISS is really that plants' ability to tolerate oxidation and free radical growth kind of can speed out of control in a low gravity environment. So basically what that is that's the plant's immune system. So I could see low G possibly affecting the plant's immune system and needing either a nutrient change or something different.
Interesting. So I think this probably follows it pretty well, but it's mostly in my knowledge, or at least with my knowledge, like growing plants has pretty much everything to do with what it's growing in. So soil or hydroponics, whatever it is, the nutrients uptake that they can actually attain. So in space, when you're having to create your own soil, things of that nature, like in right now, like rotating crops is pretty important. So rotating crops is pretty important because you have to get different types of nutrients in the ground. I know growing beans or particular types of beans puts a lot of nitrogen into the soil. How would that potentially look in space? Do you think it's going to require just a lot more input of like engineered chemicals, or would it be potentially possible to rotate crops to your soil to last or live longer?
It's a great question, and it's something that you'd want to get to at a certain point because yes, certain crops can help provide those nutrients. So Humdog Floyd, do you want to go into a little bit around soil and some of the microbial stuff?
Sure. So you could definitely have beneficial crops, and we definitely do rotations of beans and corn, and then we also do cover cropping. And all those things add nitrogen and add different nutrients to the fields themselves. But really, for sustained production, you're still going to probably want some kind of fertilizer source, some kind of added nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium mixture to help you out. All those things would be attainable, though, and definitely possible.
One thing that's interesting. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go for it.
I was just going to say one thing that's interesting to think about is a lot of times those symbiotic relationships that you're talking about, like with legumes, most legume species can it's called fixing nitrogen. So basically, what they're doing is atmospheric nitrogen is not the nitrogen that plants need for food. It has to undergo a change through either nitrification or through the nitrogen cycle to become available to plants. Legume species have formed a symbiotic relationship with something called rhizobacterium, where the rhizobacterium can colonize the roots of the legume plants, and in return, for a space to colonize the legumes, which they allow it, the rhizobacterium transfers that nitrogen from the unusable form to the usable form. And it does it in a really efficient way. Such an efficient way, actually, that you can end up with a little bit more nitrogen than the plant actually used. And so there's ways. That's part of the reason why those rotations happen like that. And certain species, like for instance, red clover, it can put like I think up to 30% of your nitrogen needs into the ground. So in a careful rotation, if you have the right rhizobacterium, you can be a lot more efficient anyway. The key would be culturing that rhizobacterium and having a library of sorts, of that kind of microbial action as well.
Go for it, Hum. And it looked like you were going to follow up to that.
I just accidentally hit it.
So that brings me to a question that I've been thinking. I really love fungi and mushrooms, and I know that they can have symbiotic relationships with plants, similar to like truffles and things of that nature. I'm curious, would there be a need for fungus in growing plants in space? I'm not really sure what their role is in terms of like everything that they do, but I'd be curious to see or understand better what their role is and whether or not you'd want to bring them along to space.
I'll touch on this one too. So I think mushrooms definitely you're gonna want. I think because if anything, it's added diversity, and they're very hardy, so they can grow in dark places. They don't need as much light. They're kind of the opposite of green plants, and so they kind of fit a niche. If you have lights in a place, you're likely to have dark in a place as well, and you'd want to use as much area as possible. The one thing I can think of with like a lot of fungi species is they're somewhat water intensive, but you can recycle that water as well. So that leads to another kind of interesting concept around recycling, and that's that much of the wastewater that you have in a system you can use for crops. You can't really use the black water, but you can use a lot of the gray water, and the plants will actually filter out any toxins or anything in it. And that leads to yet another important point, which is really this concept of bioremediation, and that you can use plants to kind of change the environment a little bit.
Could you maybe go a little bit deeper on what you mean by change the environment by depending on the plants that you grow?
Yeah, sure. So, for instance, around some chemical spills or like super sites, they've used different algae species and different plants to kind of suck up those toxins, for lack of a better word, and then they can process that material, and it takes it out of the soil. So you can use plants. They're a sink, right? They're going to take a lot of things out of the soil, even things that they don't necessarily need. And so in some ways, they're a way to even clean up the soil a little bit.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I remember reading something around like a fungus being grown near the nuclear site of like the Japanese nuclear plant that, oh god, the name's escaping me, but they had a fungus that was able to pull some of the radioactivity out of the ground.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Fungi are really hardy species, and they can grow pretty voraciously in a lot of different conditions, which is why they're being looked at a lot in that kind of way.
So I have plenty of questions that I could keep going with, but I'd love if any of the community here has some questions that they thought of while we're talking, please feel free to send them our way, or come up here on stage and ask them yourself. Chris, did you have any questions that potentially you were thinking about? I've got some around production chains. I wish Proto was here, but
I'm enjoying the conversation. Go for it with your questions. I will definitely type in though.
So when it comes to the world of Adalia and us producing, kind of the production chain for food, the end goal is to get, just food. We're it's edible. We haven't really defined it. But, do you think that there would be, I guess with algae and things like that, it's potential to have kind of a nutrient packed food bar that could supply you with everything you need, but what are your guys' opinions on kind of the like basic necessities that we would need to have? So like what combination of plants would almost be required us to live.
Like bare minimum, I kind of like where you're going. We've talked about this one too. I almost think of like blue cubes, like we have blue cubes, and there's no difference between the cubes besides the color. They're just nutrient packed, like amino acid filled, little bars or something like that you could definitely do with an algae type thing. I've thought about that quite a bit, and I think you could use a lot of food additives to maybe make it taste like whatever you wanted to. But that would be one option, is to use an algae kind of packed protein bar, bare minimum wise.
And then, oh, sorry, go for it, homie.
I was just going to add to it. That's where some of the bioengineering might come to play too. Like, there's essential amino acids. Those are the amino acids that your body requires, but it doesn't make. And we get some of those amino acids from plant species, and we get some from animals. But there's been quite a bit of work to bioengineer those amino acids into some of those plants so that you wouldn't need the animal piece of it, right? And so I think that's one avenue where that's where the science piece kind of could come into things, and making sure. So if you're thinking about like what kind of plants provide those nutrients, your grain species, most of your staple grain crops like rice, wheat, corn, potatoes, your starches are going to be pretty important for that. There's also going to be some that are, your fruit crops are going to be pretty important. One crop that's pretty interesting that I've been just looking at last couple of years, just for the number of uses, is it's a tree fruit called jackfruit, and you can use it. It almost has a meat-like consistency to it, and really. It reminds me of what the RVAD might have, from a food science department, because it's just got so many different uses. It's about 40% usable in terms of weight by yield, so it's really a heavily usable crop. So I can imagine certain crops like that cover the biggest gamut possible of those amino acids being used, being the most useful anyway.
I'd be interested to see a jackfruit tree grown in the RVAD. They're pretty big and wild looking, but yeah, I mean they're like, if you go to other countries that don't eat as much meat, like jackfruit's pretty much a staple in a lot of ways, and they do kind of like pulled pork style jackfruit. So I hadn't really thought about that. I think it would be probably a fairly difficult crop to grow in space. Maybe not.
No, it probably would be. It's gonna have a pretty narrow band of environment that it's gonna be happy with, But I'm just thinking of like the usefulness of it, and if you could make a small modular production out of a couple of different crops, maybe diversifying into something like that would be a good idea. But yeah, just for the number of uses, really kind of going back to your question.
So I know you guys aren't, full-on plant scientists and like kind of producing flavors and things like that from chemical engineering, but when we were talking about algae cubes, a blue cube or something, I'm not sure if you guys have knowledge on this, but I would be curious to understand maybe a little bit about like how difficult or easy it would be to produce edible chemicals that would flavor things so that you're not eating just mush that tastes like mush.
That's a really difficult question. Going down the food science route, I could definitely see some things are going to help with all of it. Salt is going to be one thing that kind of flavors everything. But yeah, some of those additives and things that give us a huge amount of flavor in our food come from plants that you definitely want to make sure you included some form of. Like, think about a world without pepper, or like and there's some of those staple ones, vanilla, like no more vanilla latte ever. I'd want to make sure I had at least a little bit of vanilla somewhere. or cinnamon. Some of those crops that you don't necessarily think of as staples. Boy, I wouldn't want to live without them.
Yeah, I think that probably brings us to another topic of like, the wealthy or the elite, the people who are going to do really well in Adalia, and they've mastered the production chains. That's when you start to get like luxury goods and things of that nature. So like saffron and vanilla and all these like smaller crops that are like hugely flavorful. I would almost assume that the price for those types of things would be astronomically high, because if everyone's eating the same flavored thing at all times, you would probably pay pretty much an arm and a leg for anything that tasted different. So I don't know. I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to see how potentially our game can apply these things later on in discovery and of that nature of consumable goods. I've been thinking a lot about this and what they provide. A while ago, a few years back, I designed a board game that was called Van Life, the board game. You travel across the state or across the United States. There was an aspect to it that was sanity, and sanity was a big factor in this game. And I think from the perspective of just knowing my own love for food and being confined maybe in these space stations or vehicles or ships for a long time, sanity's probably going to be a big factor, and flavor, which maybe most of us take completely for granted, would be maybe a leading factor in just literally keeping people sane in space. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that kind of goes to one of the questions around, like, what about plants that aren't necessarily for consumption? And would you want to have those plants? I think absolutely you would. You'd think anyway, if you're planning out a 150-year-long journey. I know efficiency is really important, and it's probably one of the most important things. You can't run out of supplies, of course, but in there somewhere, the psychology of taking the planet as much as possible with you would have to be a part of it, right? And I would want to at least have some flower species and some things.
Sorry, I'm not sure if it's me unable, my internet or yours, but you kind of cut out there for the last 15 seconds for me. Chris, were you able to hear him? No problem.
I did hear most of it, but worth going over again, I guess.
Okay, where was I at? Where was I at again? Trying to remember here.
JP, what did you cut off at?
Did we lose him? Did I lose all you guys?
I'm still here. I think it might be JP.
I'm still here.
Having issues. Well, let's continue then.
What was the question again? I'm starting to forget.
Let me see what difficulties he's having here. Okay, well, while he reconnects,
Okay.
a question I've been curious about. What would the physical space requirements, space, volume, etc., requirements be for growing food in space? Obviously, it's going to be, well, I assume it's going to be much more taking advantage much more of height rather than just kind of spreading over a large area. But can you try and kind of estimate what that space requirement would look like? Would it be higher than it is here on Earth? Would it be less?
Well, I think you could definitely use like a deck type system where you think about the Arvid, for example. You would have multiple decks on the Arvid. You could have farm deck on each one of them throughout part of the ship, and I got some numbers. So even the smallest asteroid that we have in the belt at 13.2 kilometers is about 247 acres. Or no, I'm sorry, 1 square kilometer is 247 acres. That asteroid would be about 3,200. So per square kilometer, you're looking at about 250 acres worth of production. And you can get quite a bit of volume out of that production. One of the biggest things I think would be the volume of water that you would need for that production.
Okay.
Just an inch acre is about 27,000 gallons, and for most grain crops, you're going to want to have 12 to 24 at least inches of water per growing cycle. So that's a lot of water. That's billions of gallons ultimately per acre.
That's a fun unit of measurement to think in, inch acre.
It is. It's an interesting one. It's a lot of gallons.
Just a giant sheet of water.
It's interesting though when you talk about like getting into three-dimensional. Right now, greenhouse agriculture is really trying to go kind of heavily into this vertical farming realm right now, and that's kind of what you're getting at. And I would say that would be heavily utilized, as well as hydroponic systems and anything really that can recycle the most amount of nutrients possible. Because space is finite.
I
Right?
even think like inter-row planting. Inter-row planting is a really good one because you're utilizing the same amount of space for multiple crops. You could definitely have vining type crops if you could get them to take hold that went up the sides. You could go vertical with it easily, I think.
I think I'm back. Are you guys able to hear me?
Yep.
You're
Awesome.
back.
Switched to the phone. My internet rugged me, so sorry about that. But I think I came in. Chris, sorry, keep going. I just wanted to make sure I was back.
Yeah. So I'm curious, and maybe this gets more into kind of like the nutrition side of the conversation, but do you have a sense of what surface area would be required to feed a human, let's say for a year? We've been kind of kicking around through game design ideas for this and kind of how much food would be required per person. We settled on a ton. It's a nice round number per year. But like how much space would be required for that to support a single human?
Got some numbers that I've kind of played around with a little bit. So I think of it like calories. A bushel of corn, 1 bushel of corn, seed corn, has about 88,000 calories worth of nutritional value. And think about like a 2,000 calorie a day diet ends up being about 730,000 calories per year per person. So just on corn, it's probably around 10 bushels just worth of kcal on corn. And
Okay.
10 bushels would be 560 pounds worth of corn. And that's assuming that you're at pretty much a bare minimum calorie intake.
Which is right around a ton. Nice.
How much space is required to grow that amount of corn?
Okay, let's see here. So a lot of hybrid production corn is getting around 250 bushels per acre. So, 250,000 per 1,000 acres. So you would get a lot of production off of even the smallest asteroid if you just did entirely corn production. You could maintain those high yields.
If you could manage all of the other resources.
Yes, but the other
Water.
resources are really the
Yeah.
tricky part.
Yeah,
Yes.
got it. So space is not going to be our limitation. Space being surface area.
So I've got it. I jotted some stuff down a while ago. Let's see here.
Yeah, can you guys hear me? Sorry, I jumped
You could
back.
feed about, if you just grew hybrid production corn, you could feed about 6,000 to 8,000 people off of a kilometer worth of hybrid production corn, that many acres.
They would definitely get tired of corn, but that's pretty impressive.
One thing I was going to say, can you guys hear me, by the way? I dropped off all of a sudden.
Yes, we can.
Yep.
Okay. But there's other crops, other crops change that kcal load as well. Like potatoes, I have some numbers here. Like potatoes, 17.8 million kcals per acre. So when you look at it that way, like, yeah, I think with diversity, you can definitely cover all your bases. You're definitely right, Chris, in that you don't want corn all the time. But one thing that kind of touches on is the usefulness of some of the crops. Some crops are useful for one purpose, really. For instance, like wine grapes. I love wine, and so I think it's useful. But when you look at the total usefulness of it compared to some of the crops, you're definitely going to want to grow some that have that well-routed. And like corn is one, soybeans. If you ever want to make cookies or anything like that, you pretty much need an emulsifier, and soy lecithin is probably one of the biggest emulsifiers there is. So certain things you're definitely going to want to have, covered bases on.
That's it's interesting because if space, like actual surface area, isn't the limiter, but the getting the goods where they need to go for water, things of that nature. It's like how when we were talking about an inch acre, like how many large or heavy transports filled with water would it take to water that same crop, that 1 acre of corn for a year? Like how many transports are you going to need to provide water for that? And I think that's where our game, along with like the science of it, is kind of a fun thing to look at. Now, we're not trying to hit it dead on in terms of being exact. I hope not, Chris, because that's going to be a even bigger challenge. But
It has to be fun.
If it has to be fun, but it would be fun to see where the fun aspect of it meets, like how close are we? Are we in an order of magnitude towards it being a reality, or how far off we are? So I doubt any of us here have the calculations, but Chris, it might be fun to follow up with the capacity of a or a heavy transport stocked full of water, how much that would equate to, and follow up there, because I want to see how close we are to actually growing an acre of corn, to feed, what was it, 6,000 to 8,000 people? You said, Hamdog Floyd?
Yeah. So let me see here. I wrote this down a while ago. I've got it to where I'll have to get back to you.
Yeah, no,
I've got my math to where it says you would need around 94,000 cubic square feet of storage for 75,000 bushels, and that 75,000 bushels could feed 9,000 people.
So now we just have to figure out how much water weight basically needed to be transported to grow that same amount.
Yep.
All right, I'm liking this. I'm excited. I want to follow up. I'll make an infographic.
Get ready to buy fuel from those I-types, I guess, right?
Yeah. Fuel is going to be needed all the time. I think we're all who live in the States are abundantly clear on how much fuel is needed now, because everything depends on fuel. The prices of everything literally depend on transportation costs. So, I think that's going to be a super interesting factor, I think, in influence, just seeing kind of the spread between how easy it is to get fuel and the price of goods in the belt as a whole. Because, right now with inflation and things of that nature, you go to the store and you buy a bag of chips that was $3 a year ago and now it's $5. Well, a large percentage of that has to do with transportation costs. So I'm really, really interested to see how all this plays out within the game. But it's quite fascinating to talk about plants in space, growing them, how to do it, the logistics behind it, everything like that. We've got about 5 more minutes. So I think this might be an opportunity, if you guys have, I don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe some closing ideas, statements, or propose any questions to us in terms of the game, and I can follow up here this next week and hopefully produce that infographic for growing corn in space and things like that.
Yeah, just want to say thanks to everybody. This is an awesome community. I think this is by far the best community that I'm a part of on Discord and online. I'm just glad to be a part of it. Glad that we could, voice our opinions in something that we have passion for and really have spent a long time doing. I guess one thing that I've always, from the very beginning, after reading the career assignments piece, one thing that was interesting to me is that removal of the soil from the ag decks. That's one thing that I caught right away, and I caught on right away to the fact that there's a farmer role in the crew member ranks, and just really, really appreciated that the realism that comes along with knowing that, hey, if you're going to be on a 150-year journey, farming and growing plants is going to have to be a part of that. So awesome. Thank you.
I'd also like to say thanks to everybody, and I this is also the only real community I'm a part of on as far as Discord goes. So I'm appreciative to get to express my opinions and what I think about the way space farming would be. I've talked countless hours about this game with my brother, and specifically about space farming. So we've always had these conversations, and I appreciate the chance to get on here and have one with a bunch of other people.
Yeah, we'll thank. But sorry, go for it.
No, I was just going to say thank you guys for coming. It was a great conversation.
Sorry, I'm a bit slower. My phone's mechanics are a little worse than the laptops. But yeah, thank you guys for coming. I really do appreciate your time. Everyone, I do want to just let you know, please just go ahead and say I was here in that OuterSpaces plant growing thread, and I will send you a DM with a code to claim your POAP for attending this. Went ahead and made that design today. So I hope you guys like it. Thanks for attending. And we'll follow up next week with our corn, water, heavy transport infographic that I'll put together once I get some info from Humdog Floyd there. I'll help you out too if you want to send me the math.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
All right,
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, happy Friday.
Awesome.
Enjoy your evening.